Good afternoon. I'm Rollie Flynn. I'm the president of the Foreign Policy Research Institute in Philadelphia. We're a nonpartisan think tank based in Philadelphia. This afternoon we have a program. It's very topical. It's called Dueling Visions: America's Role in the World Post-2020 Election. Before we get started, I'd like to also say a note about the fact that it is Veterans Day today, and to say a special thank you to our veterans, the men and women who serve our nation, and the families who support them. So thank you all. Also like to say thank you to our supporters and members who are online. We couldn't do these programs without you. For those of you who are watching, there will also be a video recorded of this in case you want to share it with your friends and colleagues or watch it again. So this is part of our mainline series. And so we would like to also thank the sponsors of our mainline program. And I'll introduce John Nagl, who will be our principal moderator this afternoon. John is known to many of you. He's the 9th headmaster of the Haverford School, and he's also a senior fellow at FPRI. He has also served on the Defense Policy Board and on the Reserve Forces Policy Board, and testified before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Served in the Army for 20 years, leading a tank platoon in Operation Desert Storm. He was also one of the principal authors of the, and I can't seem to find it on my piece, of the Counterinsurgency Field Manual. Forgive me, John. That's one of your claims.
Read by dozens of people all over the world, really.
Hundreds, thousands.
Dozen. I'll stick with dozens.
So he's also been published in major publications and has featured on television and radio. And without further ado, I will turn the program over to John to introduce our distinguished panel today.
Thanks so much, Rollie. And I'd like to take the opportunity to thank, as a veteran, not just my fellow vets of the armed services, but also those who served in the intelligence agencies and the State Department, in all the U.S. Agency for International Development, all of whom perform absolutely essential functions in preserving America's role in the world and keeping the world as safe and as amenable to America's interests as we possibly can. And Jim Mattis, a mentor to perhaps to all of us here on this panel, used to say, give the State Department more money or buy me more ammunition, because every State Department officer, every intelligence officer means soldiers don't have to do the most awful thing that we as humans do to each other. So thanks to all who participate in this great American enterprise, and thanks to the two panelists today who have both contributed in substantial ways to the American effort and will do so in days to come. First, a friend of more than 25 years, God help us both, John Hillen, now the James C. Wheat Professor in Leadership at Hampton-Sydney College's Wilson Center for Leadership in the Public Interest. John has been a trustee of the Foreign Policy Research Institute since 2008, the treasurer of the board from 2010 to 2019, a former director of the National Security Program at FPRI. The organization really runs in his blood. John is a decorated combat veteran from Operation Desert Storm and was Assistant Secretary of State for Political Military Affairs in the second half of the George W. Bush administration. John, it's great to see you again, sir, looking good. And his loyal opposition is John Gans. That's pretty good, right? The Director of Communications and Research at the University of Pennsylvania's Perry Worldhouse, and the author of White House Warriors: How the National Security Council Transformed the American Way of War. John Hillen, I looked for your book, The Blue Helmet, on my shelves. I must have loaned it out to somebody. You can grab it and show it. It was John's doctoral.
We have a new book. We have a new book out.
New book. Go ahead, John. Plug it. What happens now?
Well, this is a business leadership book, so not entirely germane to today, but it will be related, as I think John and I will tease out.
There we go. Right, two distinguished authors, as well as government servants. John Gans was chief speechwriter to the Secretary of Defense at the Pentagon. He's also served at the Treasury Department, on Capitol Hill in the office of the Speaker of the U.S. House of Representatives, and he's a Navy Reserve officer. So two enormously talented, multifaceted public servants, authors, thinkers, and we are absolutely delighted to have them both here to think about America's role in the world in a Biden administration, assuming that eventuality comes to pass. And I'd like to begin with Dr. Hillen, sir.
Sure. Well, I think that eventuality will come to pass. Certainly appears to me, but I'm just speaking as a citizen here. I have no particular expertise in that. But one of the things I wrote about in the paper for FPRI is that in the eventuality of a change in administration, which certainly looks likely, it'll be an interesting challenge for the Biden administration to about how much they could resume of what was a very long-standing tradition of American leadership in the world that held together for the most part for about 70 years after the end of World War II. I outlined 4 principal features of it in my paper for FPRI, but essentially, that American power would underpin the basic structure of the world, of the post-World War II world. And the US would not only take the lead role in making the rules, but would also take the lead role in enforcing them. Second of all, that this would be a very inclusive system. NATO, WTO, lots of different international organizations, some at a high multilateral level, some at a more targeted regional level. And that the US would seek, when it could, but not always, to lead through these kind of power structures, knowing it could dominate them. I mean, this was a self-serving proposition, with the U.S. standing really, atop the world as a colossus at the end of World War II, industrially and militarily. But it was also, one that most people who bought into that notion thought was good for the rest of the world. The third thing was that there was a general philosophical viewpoint underneath that. It was a kind of neoliberal tradition, that ultimately this U.S. power will be used to move people towards free markets, toward pluralistic democracies, toward universal human rights, towards open systems, where it could, not always. And there were some, great issues of contradiction of how that was deployed throughout the years, but it generally held as a theory that both sides signed up to. And then finally, that U.S. military power would be used regularly and muscularly around the globe. We basically had a bargain with the rest of the globe for a good 70, 80 years that within a couple of days, we'll get you some U.S. military wherever it needs to be, something. No other country in the history of the world has had a tradition of being able to have global deployment guarantees to almost every corner in some fashion. And so that has all been eroding just because of events and choices over the past, really since the end of the George W. Bush administration and the reaction of the electorate in 2008 to the seemingly endless and inconclusive nature of the Iraq and Afghanistan wars. And other, power hates a vacuum, so it fills it. And so the world has changed in the past 12 years. And I think President-elect Biden, and I'll stop here, is a conventional foreign policy thinker. I testified in front of him many times. He was the ranking Democrat on my oversight committee when I was an assistant secretary. And the Biden team is going to be full of all-stars, professionals in many ways. Most of them are friends and colleagues I deeply respect that I worked with when we were on different sides of the aisle. But I still think it's going to be tough to figure out how to put the world of 2020 back into a framework, a construct that was really formed from the 50s through the 90s and has been eroding ever since. I think that's the big challenge for the president-elect, defining the American role in this world. You can't put that toothpaste back into the tube. Much of the world has moved on. So what does it look like now?
You're muted, John.
Works better when you actually click the button. But John Gans, I'm guessing that there is a bunch of that you agreed with, and some of it, perhaps the very end, that you did not. So please, sir, the floor is yours.
Yeah, I think John, John Hillen. I have to be careful with 3 Johns here. It's basically, this is like Thanksgiving at my house, so it's nice to have 3 Johns here on the FPRI. I think that the question of the sort of post World War II American foreign policy tradition is one that is right, and I think that is one that certainly has dominated and was certainly, I think, the question mark for the first 2.5, 3 years of the Trump administration, right? How was Trump different? How was he trying to change that? How was the U.S. foreign policy bureaucracy, and how were America's allies and partners abroad trying to continue that sort of tradition of global leadership? I do think that the defining feature here that John didn't mention is the coronavirus pandemic, which has, in many ways, upended a lot of the international order that was established by the United States in the aftermath of World War II and preserved for years, including during the 21st century, right? That was an order that was being challenged. That was an order by rising powers like China, who have different visions for an international order and different visions for governance itself. And I think that it has really been fundamentally challenged by the coronavirus pandemic, which has, of course, now killed over, I think it's 1.2 million people. I think we're coming upwards on tens of millions of infections. I think the IMF has announced $28 trillion in growth has disappeared, right? This is a world-changing event. And I think what we will see, as you know, whether we get a vaccine or not in the next year or two ahead, is that we are probably going to be living, and the United States is going to be operating in a far more, let's say, Trumpian world order, right? Which is going to be more nationalist, is going to be far more competitive, is going to be far more disengaged and less connected as a result of just the changes wrought by coronavirus. So some of the biggest changes to the international order were not driven by Trump and President Trump, but were actually driven by this pandemic, which has gotten out of hand, and which, truth be told, the international order and the institutions of the international order have struggled to sort of end and counter. And so I actually think that what we're seeing is a far more Trumpian world, one that is, you know, far more nationalistic, far less conducive to interconnected and cooperation, and far probably less willing to listen to the United States, as it's less willing to listen to any international authority. I think that the UN, the WHO, all of these are damaged brands in terms of actual individuals' well-beings. And so as a result of that, I think the international order is going to go through a massive change as a result of the pandemic. And the United States is going to be a part of that. And I think that Vice President Biden, as John is sort of pointed out, has a much more classical view of American power, of America's role in the world, and how the world order should operate. And that is he is going to have to, I think, probably be far more forceful, and to a degree, he's going to have to convince Americans that's the right way, and he's also going to have to convince people abroad that that's the right way. And probably the biggest thing he's going to have to do is try to marshal America's resources and its partners abroad to try and bring an end to this pandemic, which is something that is a massive task. And I think if you could do that within the international order, it would be a huge boon for it. But that's a question mark going forward. And it's probably the biggest question mark going forward for the future of the international order and future of U.S. Leadership in the world.
That was cheery. Let me push back on you a little bit, John, if I can.
Sure. Okay.
If I can, certainly, while the international institutions have not been as successful as they would have liked to have been on the pandemic, the United States has perhaps not been as helpful to those institutions as it could have been. Mm-hmm. And so it is hard for the World Health Organization to be as effective as it might be if the world's, what I consider to be still the world's greatest power, decides to unilaterally withdraw from it. And so I expected you, honestly, to give a little more of a rousing endorsement of the Biden administration's desire to pick up where Team Obama left off. And
yeah, I mean, I think that'll. I'm happy to go into that farther. I think that the Biden administration and I think Joe Biden knows more about American foreign policy. He's arguably as experienced a president as we've had on foreign policy. I mean, you're talking on the list of people he's competing with for experience, it's George H.W. Bush, Dwight Eisenhower, and, you know, it doesn't go much farther than that, right? And George Washington, right? There's not many people who have more experience than he does. And I think he has, in his soul, a deep belief in this sort of interconnectedness of the world and America's role in leading that interconnected world. And so, you know, if anybody can convince Americans of that, I think he has the capacity to do it. I do think that Americans and those abroad are looking for results. And the coronavirus is the kind of thing that affects everybody at an individual level. When kids are going to school wearing masks because of a failure of the international order and international governments to stop a pandemic, that is a problem, whether you believe in it or not. But it's also an opportunity. And I think if Americans have at times questioned America's engagement with the world and America's leadership of the world, especially as the wars have dragged on in the Middle East and the post 9/11 wars, this is an opportunity to show them that leadership can actually impact Americans and make Americans' lives better. And so it is as tragic as this moment is, it's an opportunity. But it is not one that is going to be easy to realize. And, you know, if there's anybody that is up for it, it's Vice President Biden and the team he's going to bring in.
And President-elect Biden,
yes, that's right.
to use the term of choice on at least some networks, right, has a response to the COVID-19 virus as one of the 4 pillars of his transition plan on his website. Another one of those 4 pillars, I found this interesting, was climate change. And Dr. Hillen, could I get you to think a little bit about climate change and what you see as what America's role should be in combating climate change?
Sure. So I think it's a good issue. Like almost every issue, it goes back to the heart of your question, which is, can you pick up where Obama left off? My thesis in the paper is no, because the world was moving on all during the Obama administration, and also by choices of that administration. And it was accelerated by Trump's virulent nationalism and anti-internationalism or anti-conventional internationalist behavior. So, you know, for instance, what has happened on climate change? The president-elect has said he will rejoin the Paris Climate Accords. Most international lawyers say that's a Senate treaty approval is not necessary because that's tucked in under a UN agreement from the 90s that had already been reached. So that's all good. You can rejoin, you can get moving. I think the hard thing, and as I said in the paper, is the well-behaving, rule-following nations of the world can get together and do all the agreements they want at fancy conference rooms in Europe, but it's going to be really hard to pull those that don't want to behave, or those that see this as a mechanism of the ones who've made it to prevent others who are trying to make it to go to the next level. So, you know, just as global citizens, we should all be concerned about the incredible number of, you know, Chinese coal-fired plants that are coming online. And so on. I serve on the board of a nuclear company, so I'm a big, you know, nuclear green energy guy, but that's expensive and difficult politically, so that's probably not coming anywhere. So I think the challenge is going to be, you assume a leadership role, you assume, because I think it's President-elect Biden's nature and the nature of his team, to do it through multilateral institutions, which has been pretty common among conventional administrations of both sides, with degrees of difference that, you know, were quite tense over the years, of course. I don't want to put a sentimental gauze over all the times we disagreed over the past. But then how effective are those institutions? You know, I think Elliot Cohen, who's known to all of us, you know, has just offered a thought, and Richard Haas also, you know, we're a little under institutionalized in the world right now. And John just revealed, you know, some of the places where it hasn't served world stability or world prosperity well. So, you know, rejoining the Paris Accords of a couple of years ago, is that effective going forward, or is that a kind of sentimental appeal to, we want to show that the last guy was wrong and pulling him out? So I think that's where the hard policy work's going to be done. What are not just signals about multilateralism and wanting, people to think we're working along with everybody, but what are actually effective policy mechanisms internationally or nationally that can combat climate change?
And John Gans rejoining Paris, is that a good first step, or is that just window dressing?
I think it's a great first step. I mean, I think that demonstrating that the United States is committed to and joining the community of nations in taking this threat seriously is important. And I think that that is something that will have soft power diplomatic advantages that we have sort of forfeited, right? At the end of the day, we'll be allowed into conversations and we'll be in the rooms where these debates are being held. What I think that is missing here is that climate change isn't, the Obama administration, the Paris Agreement was a massive thing that was negotiated and important. It got everybody on the same page. It got everybody to make the same commitments. Where I think the Biden administration's opportunity here will be actually less to do with diplomacy and more to do with economics, which is the US economy is going to need a recovery from the coronavirus pandemic. The European economy is going to need a recovery. Parts of Africa, parts of Latin America, Middle East, everywhere is struggling economically. Nearly every country has experienced a recession this year. That means that that you can look at that in the negative light and say, okay, everybody's broke. How are we going to be able to fight climate change? But the opportunity there is that everybody is going to be investing money to try and get their economies going again. They're going to be sitting here trying to get that people back to work. And Joe Biden, as a candidate, has said, hey, when I see green technology, I think jobs. And the fact is if they push and they work with other countries and they work with IMF and World Bank and everybody else to push these recovery funds. And, there's some estimates that trillions are going to be spent in the years ahead on recovery into green technologies. The opportunities here are not just to commit to fighting climate change, it's actually to make progress in fighting it, right? Which is if you get some of these coal power plants offline, or in fact, you ensure they never get built in the first place, and instead you go to some of the renewable technologies, solars and things along those lines, you could actually see that progress is made on climate change, much more important than just coming to an agreement. And so there is so much of an, I've argued online and elsewhere that Joe Biden has because of the coronavirus, he has a remarkable opportunity coming into office to take aggressive actions at home and abroad to try and to end the pandemic and end the sort of economic devastations that it's caused. That opportunity allows him to shift into long-term plays like green technology and other things, institution building that a administration without this sort of crisis could never get to do. The Obama administration got in trouble for this back during the financial crisis when the first Obama White House Chief of Staff, Rahm Emanuel, said, "You never let a crisis go to waste." But the fact of the matter is that crises beget opportunities. And, Joe Biden's been around long enough to know that they don't come along very often. And the presidents who take advantage of them are the ones that we remember. And this is a massive crisis, and it will present massive opportunities to help shape the world that follows. And I think that Joe Biden is going to be able to sort of take advantage of some of those opportunities. And those will probably be more impactful at the end of the day than the Paris Agreement ever was.
John Gans sees Infrastructure Week happening in 2021 is what I just heard.
Mm-hmm.
The foreign policy challenges, not named by name on the Biden transition page, but significant nonetheless. The rising power of China, the world's greatest economy, and the one hit first by the pandemic, but also the one who I think his economy has been damaged least, perhaps dealt most successfully with it among the great powers, and has had the best economic rebound. John Gans, your thoughts on Biden's policy toward China?
It's a great question, and I think that it is one of those ones that the Democratic Party has probably reflects a lot of the sort of growth on China over the last 20, 30 years in terms of how people's views have evolved. And while I think the vice president and now president-elect during the campaign I think was, had sort of voiced some concerns and criticisms of China and its manipulation of currency, its, actions in the South China Sea and elsewhere. I think what we've seen is the collapse of faith, especially among the Democratic Party, and the idea of engaging with China, that it was going to either pull China into the community of nations or convince China or help China evolve at home so that it was more open to democracy and more respectful of human rights and things along those lines. My hunch is that the Beijing and the People's Republic of China is going to have a tough 4 years ahead. My hunch is that deals that they were able to make with the Trump administration and the Trump administration's own sort of unwillingness to really sort of police or at least hold Beijing to account for things in South China Sea and Xinjiang and with some of the sort of human rights abuses we've seen. My hunch is that those days are over, and that the Biden administration is going to hold China to account for just about everything. You were starting to see that at the end of the Obama administration, and you were starting to see it at the Pentagon and elsewhere. My hunch is that will jump forward, will become far more intense, and there will be far less of a willingness to say, we used to call these in the Obama administration the sort of agree, disagree speeches. You will see far more disagree speeches. So my hunch is that the Biden administration will be far more aggressive in pushing back on China on everything, and hoping that pushback will eventually lead to some opportunities to keep China on it, to hold China to account on Hong Kong, on Taiwan, on things along those lines in South China Sea.
And Dr. Hillen, your assessment of President-elect Biden's chances for success there?
Yeah, no, I agree largely with what John said. I think, I listed China and the way it's developed and the way it has risen in power as one of the principal examples of why the conventional foreign policy approach with deviations within it between Republican and Democratic administrations is not likely to work, because it's one of the principal examples of how the world has moved on. And China especially, the neoliberal narrative for the rise of any states in the American-dominated post-World War II world was that you'd get wealthy and open at the same time. You'd have open political systems, open economic systems, everything. China has proven that you can get wealthy without being open. We thought the Communist Party would fade away. It's not going anywhere. If anything, it's getting stronger. And now China is exerting its power. Frank Hoffman, our great friend, has asked a question in the Q&A about, is there really an American order? Well, in the Western Pacific, it's certainly a stated, many times stated, explicit Chinese goal to not be subject to an American order. An American security order in the Pacific, an American financial order, an American trade order, an American monetary order, or an American political order. My old boss, Bob Zellick, who was on FPRI yesterday, coined that wonderful term, which was part and parcel of our approach in the Bush administration of how to make China a responsible stakeholder. And I said, they're willing to be a stakeholder, but not in a system that they didn't construct. They're going to be a responsible stakeholder in a system that they construct. And so I think this is the challenge of the next 3, 4, 5 administrations, American administrations, is how to engage with China, one of our largest trading partners, the second largest economy in the world. You gave them first place there, Headmaster. They're not quite in first place yet, but they're really close and surging. And as you shrewdly noted, not only undamaged, but perhaps in the ascendant, in the aftermath, the immediate aftermath of COVID, and yet still struggling with their own soft power and their ability to have it be attractive. China sometimes has trouble being an attractive leader that other powers want to follow, as opposed to one they have to follow. The U.S., of course, has struggled with that over times in its own leadership history. But I think this is a long-term challenge for multiple administrations. President-elect Biden's going to get a shot at it first, which is constructive engagement without letting China's relentless project of replacing our notion of order in the Asia Pacific with their notion of order.
China.
John, can I just add one thing? The only thing I think that this is China is a 4 or 5 administration project, but I do think that China is in a jam, which is that they are a rising power, but they have not finished rising. And at the end of the day, they have in the last year seen a collapse in their reputation in democracies around the world. And at the end of the day, that is a real, China has become less of an elite problem and more of a political problem. And this is something that I think our politics have gotten slightly weird in the United States, which is that for the past 2 elections, it has been very much focused on the character of one person, which is Donald Trump. And at the end of the day, we didn't have a real rich debate here in this year about policy and about, whether it was unemployment policy or healthcare policy or foreign policy. But at the end of the day, China is a concern of everyday citizens in the United States and Canada and Europe and Australia and Japan and things along those lines. And that is their problem, which is, for much of the past 10, 15, 20 years, the president has actually had to keep his party at bay when it comes to China, whether it was Barack Obama and human rights and labor, or whether it was some of the hawks in the Bush administration. And so you have a challenge where at a certain point, the politics are going to be against China, in the sense that the president is the more forceful he's going to be, the more powerful he will be politically. And so the concern I think China has to think about is that's not just playing out in the United States, it's playing out in Canada, that's playing out in Europe, that's playing out in Latin America, that's playing out in Asia. And so the question is whether they have sort of ruined the prospects for their rise with the sort of populations in these countries, and whether they're going to sort of bear the brunt of that before they've actually gotten the power they need to sort of survive.
And John, I'll give you one more quick example of this because it bounces back to U.S. and the U.S. role. I was in Japan for a while. It was 5 years ago this month, in November 2015, and there's a virulent debate, domestic debate in Japan, about not renewing the part of the Japanese constitution that says there'll never be a nuclear power. And so I went and met with one of my Japanese foreign ministry friends, very high up in the foreign ministry, who was an interlocutor of mine during my time in the State Department. And I said, boy, you guys must really be worried about China. You're thinking of going nuclear, huh? This is serious business. And he looked at me, put his hands on my shoulder. He said, hey, friend, it's not about China. It's about you guys. He's like, if we thought you were there for us all the time, but you've been kind of pulling back since the Iraq and Afghanistan, wounds of the early aughts. And we can sense American power is retrenching, and we got to take care of ourselves. So we argued about that. I disagreed with them. What politics stops at the water's edge. I was over there, and I'm friends with many of the people who constructed the Asia policies of the Obama administration and thought they were well constructed. But it was an interesting point of his. He says, we're revising our constitution to potentially, be a nuclear power with a military dimension, because of you, not because of China. So both these things come into play with the choices of other countries that they go through over the next couple of decades.
And I'd just like to disagree with both of you, I think, for the first time this conversation, and say that China, I think, is one of very few powers in the world whose relative status has increased as a result of COVID, where both the United States and Europe have not succeeded. And I'm gonna ask my last question and then turn it over. We've got some great questions coming into Q&A, which Rollie is going to moderate. But I'm going to ask about Europe, about America's alliances with Europe, and about the at least initial object of those alliances, Russia. So starting with John Gans.
That's great. Well, I think that one of the last conversations I had, well, I won't say it was, I think it was like the third day before I left the Pentagon on January 20th, January 19th, 2017, is we were talking a little bit about Russia and the Trump administration's approach to Russia. And my hunch was anybody who has sat in a meeting about Russia in government for the past 10 years and probably longer has had these moments where you see just a massive amount of evidence that Russia was being far more aggressive against America's allies and partners and NATO, as well as against America's homeland, right? Like these are demonstrable things that were obvious to even speechwriters. Like if we can pick up the signals in the classified material, believe me, they're obvious to anybody who's looking at them when the speechwriters can connect the dots. And at the end of the day, this is one of those ones where everybody in governments and capitals, all across Eastern Europe, all in Europe and in the Defense Department and elsewhere, has seen the writing on the wall about Russia and said, we have a problem here. This is a power that is not accepting the facts on the ground, that is trying to create them and is pushing aggressively in cyberspace, in the air, at sea, and elsewhere. And so one of the big mysteries, and one of those ones I'm not a conspiracy-minded person, has always been why, if Donald Trump is getting this exact same information, he doesn't feel the same way. It is pretty obvious his government feels that way. It is one of the few issues where you see pretty close uniformity across government, whether it's Treasury, Defense Department, State Department, about frustrations with Russia's actions. And so my hunch is that Russia has a rough 4 years coming, at least, mostly because the Democrats, I think, have had their druthers in 2017, at the beginning of 2017, end of 2016, after the sort of misinformation campaigns that sort of affected the 2016 election, would have taken far greater actions if they could have. And I believe that the track record of Russia since then is much stronger. Again, this is one of those moments where if the Biden administration is smart, the crisis that Trump has created within the NATO alliance has, I think, stoked a lot of actions within NATO partners and NATO allies, which they might not have taken if there was not some doubt about America's commitment to the alliance and to the continent and to countering Russia. You're seeing increased spending. You are seeing willingness to participate and willingness to reform and renew and rejuvenate NATO that you probably wouldn't have seen if the United States was just its usual fully robust commitment to NATO. And so my hunch is that commitment and that increased resolve within the alliance that has happened, Joe Biden, a committed transatlanticist, if there is one, is going to be able to take advantage of that, because there is a tremendous amount of momentum that has built up within NATO to counter Russia and to push back on Russia. And he doesn't have to convince them of that, right? That's usually the first thing that everybody has to do. They're there, and the money's there, and the resources are there. He just needs to go in and take advantage of it and commit it. So my hunch is that you're going to see probably, a resounding American commitment to NATO. It is probably, I don't think there's anybody who's more looking forward to those speeches than Joe Biden. I mean, this is something he's been talking about for decades. And my hunch is that that NATO is going to be willing to hear it. And I think the days where Russia is going to get away with the things that they've gotten away with over the past 4 and maybe 4, 5, 6 years, if you count some of the things they were doing at the end of the Obama administration, I think those are not going to be cost-free anymore. And I believe that NATO is going to stand with the United States on this thing. I don't think there's any doubt about that in my mind. So I'm interested to hear what John Hillen has to say.
As am I.
Yeah, a slightly different viewpoint. So I thought candidate Trump's remarks on NATO were so outlandish, they were enough for me to come out against him in the New York Times, as a senior GOP national security policymaker. But if I'm calling balls and strikes over the past 4 years and trying to do it fairly, here's where I think actually the rhetoric outstripped the actions. And I remember, because I used to travel, there go my lights, let me get those back on. We're eco-friendly, headmaster.
That's good. That's good. Good for climate change.
Yes, I'm worried about it. So I used to travel with the Secretary of Defense as the state rep on their plane. And there was a Verkunde the big NATO policy conference in Munich, where Bob Gates went over there and was very impolite with our allies about their contributions to the NATO alliance. Now, of course, Trump kind of takes it to a whole new level and puts on his own unique spin, I think it's fair to say, on top of that. But this is something we've been on for a while. And in the meantime, I think the alliance has held together pretty well throughout this. And if you look at, instead of the rhetoric, you look at the actions, the three big Russian geopolitical moves, traditionally geopolitical, because I think John hit a very interesting point of, the cyber war and everything they're doing and the information warfare, and our friend H.R. McMaster is very good on that. But the three big traditional geopolitical moves were the attack into Georgia at the end of the Bush administration, and then the taking of Crimea and Eastern Ukraine during the Obama administration. Since then, Russia has not made a major classic geopolitical move for whatever reason. I think sometimes we give ourselves too much credit that we're the reason for why people are doing things. There's reasons over there. So I think sometimes, I think here the rhetoric about the Trump NATO, Trump alliances versus Biden NATO, Biden versus alliances is maybe a little higher than the policy on the ground. I don't think there's that much repair work to be done. I don't think American diplomats and new appointees need to rush over and start apologizing to everybody in Europe for America's behavior over a long time. I just think they need to get to work and look at this situation and pull together as an alliance, our best and most lasting and most effective alliance. But Russia certainly hasn't made a major geopolitical move and has invested in causing mischief in other ways over the past 4 years. And I think that's probably a good starting point for the new administration.
I do just say one I think what they've done in Syria and the Middle East has been fairly aggressive. So I do think that, these are places where
fair point.
That's just one. That's another piece of the puzzle, in addition to sort of the misinformation attacks on the democratic processes. So
I agree.
I think, go ahead.
Over 2 administrations, we've also sent a lot of signals that anybody can do whatever they want there, and that's been confusing.
Yeah.
So I've done Rollie wrong by leaving not enough time to answer the great questions in the chat. Before I turn it over, I just want to give a shout out to Professor Robert O'Neill, who was the doctoral dissertation supervisor for both John Hillen and myself at Oxford, and who was tuned in from 12 hours away in our great and noble allies, Australia. Dr. O'Neill, Professor O'Neill, thanks for all you did for me and for John. Rollie, over to you.
Thank you. As John Nagl said, we have a lot of questions. Before we get to them, I have my own question, which is, you've talked about the dueling visions of the different administrations and what we think is coming with the Biden administration. But I'd like to, and by the way, we have put John Hillen's excellent article, there's a link to it in our chat box if you want to read it. But beyond sort of the doctrine, what's the role of personality of the president? And I recall that some observers, for instance, talk about the schmooze factor and have criticized, for instance, Obama, that he couldn't get close and have working relationships, not only with foreign leaders, but even on the Hill. And I think there was some hope that Trump coming in with his art of the deal would be sort of a schmoozer and be able to have relationships. And once again, I'm reading about Biden being the schmoozer who can get stuff done. So it's one thing to have a vision and a doctrine and an agenda, and that's another thing to get others to play ball. Can you comment on that? And why don't I'll start with John Hillen.
Okay, thanks. Yes, I do think it matters. Style matters, absolutely. I still think policy and power trump style in the end, but I'd rather have the whole trifecta to go along when trying to get things done and advance national interest. My own experiences with Senator Biden and then Vice President Biden over years is charming, intelligent, knows his brief very, very well. And so I think those are all things in our favor. In terms of applying a presidential leadership style to getting things done on the world stage. I would say, however, I was disturbed having known both men, one better than the other. And this goes to maybe judgment, which is another important facet of policy. John made the correct point that Joe Biden is tremendously experienced, but it was always curious to me that Bob Gates chose to put in his autobiography, comment that Joe Biden had been wrong on every major foreign policy issue over the past 40 years. Now, I think that was just a factor of they were on different sides of of all those foreign policy choices over the years. But I think that might be a challenge point for President-elect Biden, which is to not say, I just wasn't on the other side from some conventional wisdom, but I have a good judgment that can be used as a leader to rally people around something and get them to all from across both sides of the aisle move towards it.
Yeah, John Gans.
Yeah, it's a great question. My hunch is that the vice president, I think, having watched him the past couple months, and he was obviously a professor at Penn, so I watched him a little bit. I mean, my read on the whole thing is that he probably does one thing better than most, which is that he brings you into the cause. He brings you into the mission and the fight. And my hunch is that he is going to be able to leverage the deep relationships he has all over the continent and really all over the world, in Europe and elsewhere, to be able to sort of say, hey, the United States just went through this. I don't want to see you go through this, because I think, we need to deliver for our people, security, prosperity. We need to do this, and I can't do it alone. We need to do it with you. I think he's very good at that. I think he's done that throughout the campaign. And my hunch is that his campaign has been a battle for the soul of the United States, which he said time and time again. He said it from the beginning. My hunch is that when he's abroad, he'll say this is a battle for the soul of, a globalized, interconnected, rules-based world, and we can't do it alone. So my hunch is that there is going to be an urgency here that perhaps was lacking in previous administrations to try to stand up for this, because between COVID and for partisans, the Trump administration, this is going to be the past couple of years, and the next couple of years are going to be a brush with death for the sort of that order. And my hunch is that he's going to try and pull like-minded, democratically minded administrations and presidents and countries into collaboration to try and save this order. That's, I think, his real mission right now, and that's the thing he's worried about, and will be working on globally in the days ahead and years ahead.
We've got a lot of questions. I'm going to try to get through them quickly. Nick Gavozdov, who's our Orbis editor, building on John Gans' comment, linking domestic agenda to climate change, in other words, building jobs, investment, et cetera. How does the domestic agenda link to other foreign affairs priorities for us? In other words, how much does our domestic agenda influence what we do overseas? John Gans.
It's a great question. My hunch is that one of the things that the Democratic Party, a lot of sort of key operatives in the Democratic Party committed themselves to over the past 4 or 5 years, was to basically figure out a way to make globalization work for the American middle class, right? This has been an effort at Carnegie Endowment, which has been, gotten the blessings of people like Bill Burns, the sort of world-class American diplomat, one of the deepest, most, a candidate for Secretary of State in the Biden administration, and probably one of the people that's most respected in the sort of foreign service from both parties. He wrote a piece a few weeks ago in the Atlantic that basically said, there's a way to do this, right? There's a way to do international order, American-led international order, globalization, free trade that actually supports American livelihoods. And that is the issue of the day. And so my hunch is there's going to be some real effort to do that, but over the long term. But this crisis is so hot. I think we're all sitting here on Zoom and we've all gotten used to this, but the Philadelphia area is completely inundated with COVID right now, right? And that until we get this arrested, we're not going to go back to the way we were or the way we could be. And so my hunch is that any international trade, any international study, any international engagement is got to start with getting Americans out of their house, not just getting our house in order. And so at the end of the day, this is the critical thing to fix. And this is, frankly, the critical thing to ensuring America's relationship with the world, because we've all gotten used to this over 9 months. But in another year, if Americans aren't traveling abroad and doing those sorts of things, America's relationship with the world will be fundamentally different at the end of it. So my hunch is that this COVID fight at home is the fight for America's relationship with the world. And it is deeply tied to that in the years ahead.
Rollie, a brief thought from me on this. I talked in the paper about the progressive critique of conventional foreign policy, which has become more interesting and I think more powerful and more resonant over the years. As far as progressives consider, the conventional foreign policy that largely both parties have adopted has delivered a world that's defined by income inequality, by racial inequities, by climate problems, and on. And they want to see foreign policies serving those. We tend to think of those as domestic priorities, but they're also international priorities. And on the other side of the political spectrum, I think political leaders who are interested in foreign policy and the connection you alluded to, I mean, how do I keep together that Trump coalition? This is labor unions on the left, as well as other, which likes tariffs, which thinks that sending jobs overseas doesn't benefit anybody, let alone them. And there's just a lot of frayed bargains in everybody's domestic politics that I think are going to very powerfully shape the foreign policy choices of elected politicians on both sides.
We have a question from our Robert Strauss Hupé chair, Robert Kaplan, who asked, don't we have the opposite challenge with China, and that the relationship has become so hostile, dysfunctional in ideology that Biden has to work with the Chinese to set up new parameters and rules regarding this rivalry? Otherwise, we could have another Cuban Missile Crisis. I'll just toss it out to whichever one of you would like to answer. Okay.
John, do you want to start?
Well, yeah, I've known Bob for a long time. I don't think it's a question. I think it is received wisdom from one of the brightest people that America's luckiest to have. And I'll just say, yeah, that is certainly going to be on the table for our next leader, which is, if it's dueling systems, I'd rather figure out how they might fit together in some way that benefits both parties than get into an era of tension, whether it's Cold War or potential flashpoints.
The only thing I would add to that is this kind of gets to my point, which is that the United States electorate is in a very different place on China. The Democratic Party is in a very different place. The members of the Democratic Party, the members of the Republican Party are in a very different place on China. I think that is perhaps, this was something that boiled during the Obama administration, which was that the Obama administration was dealing with Beijing on a number of matters and trying to do what we called, agree, disagree. I think that is probably a far more difficult sort of two-dimensional chess play to make today than it was 8 years ago. And my hunch is that it is going to be a persistent challenge for policymakers to be able to sort of make those deals, because the risk of Trump, right? The sort of Trump is not. I joked with somebody the other day that Trump having existed and being elected and getting over 70 million votes, 47, 48% of the vote is a reality. And this is a new reality, and that everybody who is going to foreign policy meetings, whether it's Joe Biden, Xi Jinping, or all the people below them going to meetings, will never probably discuss him in meetings, but he will be there. That Donald Trump's presence will be there. I joke that it's like being a parent, right? once you're a parent, you never stop being a parent. You might have moments where it feels normal, but somewhere off in the world, there is your kid, and you know you have to worry about them, right? Donald Trump has changed that. And so the risks of American politics putting Donald Trump back in office, or somebody like Donald Trump back in office, will make it far harder to make those deals and make those sort of wink and nod agreements that have sort of kept the U.S.-China relationship going for the past, really, since the sort of normalization of relations, right? So my hunch is that that the politics of this in the United States has gotten out of control. And I think the fear has always been that the politics and the nationalism in China will get out of control. But my hunch is that both of these are the genie's out of the bottle in both populations. And so being able to negotiate that, I think they're going to have far less room to negotiate and make those sort of wink and nod agreements than sort of George H.W. Bush had 30 years ago, Bill Clinton had 25 years ago, and even George W. Bush and Barack Obama had. And, you know, my hunch is that that's going to be far harder, and the Biden administration's not going to want to risk, you know, seeing another Trump rise over a deal with China, would be my hunch.
Yeah. We still have a ton of questions, but I'm going to turn to one from Lawrence Husick, who's one of our senior fellows, asking, will the new administration find time to construct a rational policy for dealing with sub-Saharan Africa? And I have ulterior motives in asking that question, because FPRI in the new year is going to be standing up an Africa program. So I turn it to the two of you.
My hunch, you know, I think that, you know, we will have, I think, and we didn't get into the foreign policy implications of Donald Trump's war with government that he's been fighting, and appears, based on the news stories, still is fighting over the last 70 days to sort of undermine the State Department, the Defense Department, and things along those lines. But, you know, if you are interested in Africa and interested in these things, you know, just the Joe Biden transition announcements that have been made in the last 24 hours about teams being stood up to rebuild the State Department and things along those lines, with committed people who have worked on Africa for years, development for years, and things along those lines. This is an opportunity to have, you know, a thoughtful, functioning government again. And so my hunch is that that might not be the top of the priority list, but it will be a priority in the Biden administration, and one that will be thoughtfully staffed and certainly driven by people who believe in the things I'm sure you believe in.
I think it's probably right. Linda Thomas Greenfield, who I know, Ambassador Linda Thomas Greenfield, who's extraordinarily talented, multiple ambassadorships, former Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs, is leading the Biden landing team for the State Department. So that's a good sign. I know, you know, the sub-Saharan African policy was really important on a personal level to President George W. Bush. And I think that among the things he's most proud of in a challenged administration is the PEPFAR program and what he does. And he's been known to travel back frequently to Africa to deal with that. So I would think there's a lot of opportunity. I will say, Rollie, my guess is we will probably demilitarize some of our policy. You know, the Trans-Sahel terrorist threat will always remain, but I think what both candidates shared during the campaign is a general dovishness, I think, for the most part, about extended or difficult or inconclusive U.S. military deployments. I don't know if the Biden administration would put what we do in Africa into that category. Probably not. It doesn't deserve that. But I do think he has talked strongly about rebuilding diplomacy and diplomatic mechanisms. So I think it'll, you know, sometimes when we think of Africa and American policy, all we think is AFRICOM, you know, the combatant command. And we need to think of it in a much broader sense than that.
Thank you. And with sincere apologies to all of you whose questions, excellent questions, we just could not get to. So we're going to sign off. But before we do, I want to thank John, and at John Nagl and the Haverford School as well. And I would also like to give a shout out to our co-chairs for the main line, James Gately, John Piasecki, and Eileen Rosenau. As I mentioned before, we can't do it without you, so we're very grateful. If you're not a member yet, please consider becoming a member and check us out on www.fpri.org. Thank you, stay safe, and we'll see you at our next event.